Welcome to Bharati 100, a podcast dedicated to exploring the life and legacy of Indian national poet C. Subramania Bharati, 100 years after his death. This is Meera T. Sundararajan, Bharati's great-granddaughter.
भारत समुदायं वाळ्गवे जय 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 भारत समुदायं वाळ्गवे 30 கோடி ஜனங்களின் சங்கம் முழுமைக்கும் பொது உடைமை 30 கோடி ஜனங்களின் சங்கம் முழுமைக்கும் பொது உடைமை ஒப்பில்லாத சமுதாயம் உலகத்துக்கு ஒரு புதுமை இந்த உலகத்துக்கு ஒரு புதுமை இந்த உலகத்துக்கு ஒரு புதுமை भारत समुदायं वाळ्गवे जय 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 भारत समुदायं वाळ्गवे.
I'm beginning this episode with one of Bharati's national songs, Desiya Geethangal in Tamil. Bharati composed many patriotic songs, and the goal was to stir up nationalistic fervor in the heart of both singers and listeners. In this case, he marks the poem to be sung to Behag raga, and that's an interesting choice because Behag is a raga that's usually associated with Hindustani music, that is the classical style of North India, but it's also sung by Carnatic musicians who sing in the classical style of South India. In South Indian tradition, poetry and music are often regarded as a single, unified art form. And this was the character of Bharati's creativity. He wrote both the poetry, the words, and the musical melodies to which those words could be sung. As you'll notice, when it comes to the national songs, his melodies are deliberately simple, very catchy, captivating, easy for anyone to learn, and totally memorable. All of that was part of his artistic design. When Bharati first published his national songs, he dedicated the volume to an Irish woman, Sister Nivedita, who was born with the name Margaret Elizabeth Noble, came to India as a follower of Swami Vivekananda to promote education for Indian women. For Bharati, she was a supremely inspiring figure. In his dedication, he says that she taught him the meaning of service to the nation. This background is especially fascinating to consider today when nationalism has acquired such negative connotations, particularly in the West. But as you can see, nationalism meant something very different to Bharati, and in fact to many of the key figures in India's freedom movement. For Bharati, it was an expansive idea. By being a nationalist, he also considered himself an internationalist and a universalist, a humanist at heart. The words of the song reveal his worldview. The title, Bharata Samudayam Varhave, Bharata Nadu, this is the ancient name by which he refers to India, Bharat Mada as well, Mother India. Samudayam is society. Varha is very difficult to translate into English, but it's extremely easy to translate into French. For example, if we were to say, Vive land, vive la France. Long live India, long live France. The French expression is a perfect translation not only of the literal meaning of the word, but also of the spirit. In this poem, Bharati talks about the kind of country and indeed the kind of world that he wants to live in. He explains how he wants India to set an example for the rest of the world, and there are some very famous lines in it. So he talks about 300 million people, which was then the population of India. And he says, all of these people are one clan, one race. They are the people of my country. Not only that, he says, Yelarum yennattu mannar. Mannar means king, ruler. We are all rulers of this country. He says, if even one person has to go without food, we will destroy the whole world.
பாரத சமுதாயம் வாழ்கவே, ஜெய 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 பாரத சமுதாயம் வாழ்கவே. இனி ஒரு விதி செய்வோம், அதை எந்த நாளும் காப்போம். இனி ஒரு விதி செய்வோம், அதை எந்த நாளும் காப்போம். தனி ஒருவனுக்கு உணவில்லையெனில் ஜகத்தினை அழித்திடுவோம். தனி ஒருவனுக்கு உணவில்லையெனில் ஜகத்தினை அழித்திடுவோம்.
Our focus now turns to the national movement, one of the most thrilling and dynamic periods of history. It was a very exciting period of history, not only for India, but in fact for the world at large. So many key ideas that laid the foundations of modernity emerged during this period. The Indian freedom movement was the first time when we really started to talk about concepts like human rights or equality on the global stage. Within India, it was a very exciting time. It was a time of a tremendous flowering. In fact, you could call it a renaissance. And in fact, one of the essays in this book of collected English writings by Subramania Bharati is actually called Renaissance. He talks about the comprehensive nature of the change that's afoot in India, which is exactly what we see. We see people from all over the country becoming involved in the movement. So it was a very culturally diverse movement at heart and brought together many different kinds of people with many different varieties of backgrounds in a common cause. To make things even more interesting, there were a number of people from Great Britain, from Ireland, and from Europe who not only sympathized with the freedom movement, but ended up participating in it. There were many foreigners who came to India, settled there, and became not only participants, but leaders in the national movement. So it was an incredibly diverse movement, both within India and in terms of its international reach. It was a time when India was becoming well known in the world, and Indian ideas were finding their way into the mainstream of European thought. Take a seminal work like T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, which includes Sanskrit words and makes several references to Sanskrit philosophy, particularly in that famous final section. So the influence of India was being felt. India was becoming known through this sort of reverse pipeline established by the British colonial presence. Not only Indian culture, but more generally, also the theme of mysticism and spirituality, which have always been associated with India, but during the early 20th century enjoyed a resurgence, again, not only in India, where the freedom movement was seen in an important respect as being of movement towards spiritual regeneration of the country, but again, internationally as well, with artists and visionaries in many different countries becoming interested in exploring mystical ideas and developing them through the different kinds of media in which they worked. It's important to remember that at the time when all of this was happening, India's freedom from British rule was by no means a given. Now, with the benefit of historic hindsight, it seems to us inevitable that, of course, the British had to leave India, and similarly that other countries in the world that were part of the empire also had to gain their independence. But at the time, nothing could have been further from the truth. And I think it's so important for us to try to use our imaginations to go back and put ourselves in the shoes of the people who were actually alive at that time, 100 years ago, and experiencing what was happening in India of that time, which the British were administering. It was a time when Britain was a nation of incredible power and influence in the world. It was the largest imperial territory, the most powerful imperial force that had ever existed in human history. So imagine a situation where the nationalists in India were looking to escape from the grip of a power of such enormous presence in the world. And then think about that from the perspective of someone like C. Subramania Bharati. Here was a man who had no particular authority in the world. He wasn't a man who came from a wealthy family. In fact, his father might have been a wealthy man. He was actually an entrepreneur who tried to develop the cotton industry in South India and was doing quite well with that. In fact, he was doing so well with it that the British came and ran him out of business. And he ended up going bankrupt and died as a result of that experience. Of course, Bharati, his son, saw that happening. But the result of all of that was that Bharati himself was not materially well off, and he had no real position in the society, nothing to stand upon, and to assert himself as a person of substance even, to say that here I am opposing the government. He was a man who was completely bereft of any sort of social status in that sense in the world of that time, and in particular in the British world of that time. And on the other side of things, you had this immensely powerful imperial presence. So it was by no means given that the struggles of people like Bharati were going to yield fruit. And I think it's also really important to understand against what tremendous odds these people were seeking to effect change, and the kind of character, integrity, determination, and clarity of vision that was required in order for these people to develop a vision of a free India and pursue that. You know, people today often talk about how the freedom fighters sacrificed their lives in order for India to be free. That's a very real thing. It's not some sort of notional idea of sacrifice. These were people who spent their lives fighting an imperial power with absolutely no certainty of any kind. In Bharati's own case, throughout his entire lifetime, he never saw India's freedom. He died in 1921, well before freedom, which only came in 1947. So, again, the perspective was visionary and looking far into the future, far beyond the constraints and the terrors of the present situation under British rule. We should never forget that. These were people who imagined a world that could be different, fundamentally different from the world that they lived in, and they committed themselves wholesale, body and soul, to the pursuit of that vision, with absolutely no guarantees about the results that would come. It's very inspiring. The Indian freedom movement introduced so many important ideas to the world, and it's also important to remember that it was the first movement of its kind to be successful. So it was the first anti-imperial movement of rebellion that succeeded in loosening the grip of a colonial administration, in fact, the premier colonial administration in the world, as I've just been describing. So Indian freedom generated a process that we often now call decolonization. It was the first of many countries that were to find their independence in the decades that followed the Indian freedom struggle. All of this, I think, is so significant for us today because we should consider it in the light of the world that we live in. So coming now to our current perspective, we clearly live in a world where a number of crises have developed, very broad existential crises. And I think at least two aspects there that we need to consider are the crisis of inequality or intolerance in the world on the one hand, and then, of course, the climate crisis on the other. Considering the background that I've just described regarding the Indian freedom movement helps us to see what's happening in today's world as a sort of natural consequence in a way, of the experience of colonization and a reflection of a process of decolonization that's incomplete. Why do I express it in that particular way? Well, I think about Bharati's writing, and of course all of my thinking on this is totally informed by his writing and by his perspectives for two reasons. Not only because he is a wonderful and original and very insightful thinker, but also, secondly, a really important reason, he is an eyewitness to the phenomena that he's talking about. He lived through it. The story that he tells is a first-person narrative, first and foremost. So I'm tremendously influenced by his thinking, and looking at the vision that he outlines in his writings, we've certainly progressed towards realizing the ideals that he talks about in terms of equality and peaceful coexistence with our fellow humans, as well as with the environment. But we still clearly have a long way to go. So our rhetoric has improved as a result of the Indian freedom movement, and in fact all of the powerful processes of decolonization that have happened in the decades following Indian independence as well. But we clearly have a long way left to go before reaching meaningful destinations. I would suggest that many of the crises that we're seeing today are manifestations of an incomplete process of decolonization. Now, of course, political decolonization has occurred. That goal of getting the British colonial administration out of India and converting to a form of self-rule, to being self-governing, Swaraj, as the Indian freedom fighters spoke of it, that has been achieved. And that's what has been achieved in other countries that have decolonized as well. So that's step one. Clearly, political decolonization is necessary. But what about the further phases of decolonization? We need to continue to travel down that road with a view to changing our attitudes towards our fellow humans and towards the environment in which we live, because we've reached a point of crisis and we need to find solutions. Political decolonization is step one. There also needs to be a decolonization at the level of inequality in the global community. And of course, there needs to be a decolonization of the human mind. I'm talking specifically about the exploitative attitude that modern societies inevitably seem to have towards nature as well as our fellow humans, our fellow cultures. And this can be traced directly back to the process of Britain's colonization of India. After all, if we consider it in historical perspective, we should remember that colonization began as a commercial endeavor undertaken by the East India Company. And by about the mid to late 19th century, the activities of the East India Company had become so important and so lucrative, and their presence in India had become so delicate and at the same time important to Britain, that ownership of that endeavor was transferred from the East India Company to the British Crown. Why did all of this begin? Well, it goes back to the birth of the Industrial Revolution and the fact that Britain had suddenly entered a period of great technological expansion where it needed two things. It needed natural resources to feed into that economic process, and it needed new markets. India provided both. Considering that deep history underlying the very process of colonization, it becomes much easier to see, I think, how many of today's attitudes have their roots in that process. And today, they don't serve us too well.
எல்லாரும் ஓர் குலம் எல்லாரும் ஓர் இனம் எல்லாரும் இந்தியா மக்கள் எல்லாரும் ஓர் குலம் எல்லாரும் ஓர் இனம் எல்லாரும் இந்தியா மக்கள் எல்லாரும் ஓர் நிறை எல்லாரும் ஓர் விலை எல்லாரும் இந்நாட்டு மன்னர் நாம் எல்லாரும் இந்நாட்டு மன்னர் ஆம் எல்லாரும் இந்நாட்டு மன்னர் ஆமாம் எல்லாரும் இந்நாட்டு மன்னர் பாரத சமுதாயம் வாழ்கவே ஜய 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 பாரத சமுதாயம் வாழ்கவே